Hello, everyone. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year, and we're happy you joined us for this one today. We are presenting the webinar entitled Navigating the IVDR Landscape, Unraveling the Complexities of Software as a Medical Device. Before we begin, I'd like to mention just a few housekeeping items. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat option in your Zoom menu bar. Send us a message and we'll do our best to help you resolve that. You can enable audio transcription for the webinar today by clicking the captions button and show captions. A full transcript can also be enabled so that you can follow along with our presenters throughout the presentation. If you have any questions about our content today, you don't have to wait until the end. There's a Q&A option in your Zoom menu bar. Send us your questions at any point during the presentation, and we'll run through as many as we can after the presentation is completed. If we don't get to your question, we will get in touch with you later by email. Throughout the webinar, we'll also be sharing important resources and links in the chat for our attendees to access, like other related webinars or information sources. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on our website after the webinar is completed. You will also receive an email with a link to the recording and slides. Lastly, I encourage everyone to take our short survey once the webinar ends. Your feedback helps us create content that matters to you. Again, we're glad you joined us for the live webinar today with Dr. Sarah Chavez. We'll be answering your questions on navigating the IVDR landscape and unraveling complexities of software as a medical device today. Dr. Chavez is Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services at Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for almost 20 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. Now I'm going to go ahead and hand this presentation over to Sarah, who'd like to present to you content today. Sarah?
Yes, thanks so much, Mark. So I'm excited about today's webinar. We get a lot of questions about software as a medical device, and usually we don't have the time to really devote to the specific issues for this topic. So today we thought we would take a step back and just provide some overview of what software as a medical device really entails, some basic definitions, and then focus mostly on some practical strategies to help you navigate the regulations, both from the IVD or the MD, the medical device perspective. So I'm hoping by the end of today's webinar, you'll have a better understanding of what these regulations really mean in terms of how to approach your software. And it will help you sort of come up with a strategy as you're trying to get yourself to the point where you're going to be navigating compliance and starting to make regulatory decisions. So we have our learning objectives laid out here. There are quite a few, so we're going to try to cover quite a bit of ground. But mostly at the end of today's webinar, we want to make sure that you have a good idea of some of these common challenges to anticipate and the ability to explore potential solutions and be proactive so that you can really streamline your regulatory compliance process. So next slide, please. Okay, let's start with some definitions. First off, I've noticed that there's a lot of confusion whether you're looking at different blog posts or different references online. Software can fall into many different categories. So you can have software as a medical device. That's what we're talking about here today primarily. But that's when a software is intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. You can also, though, have software in a medical device, and that's when the software cannot operate separately without the medical device in question. Now, just to add an extra layer of complexity, you can have software as an accessory to a medical device. And in that case, too, the software doesn't fulfill the medical purpose in and of itself. And to try to streamline this entire process, the IVD has actually just developed one straightforward definition, which is medical device software. And that basically is all encompassing. It's software that's intended to be used alone or in combination for its intended purpose as specified by the definition of a medical device under the IVDR. So luckily for us, the European Commission has provided some fairly decent guidance documents for software manufacturers and tailored to software. And the goal of these guidances is first and foremost to determine whether or not your software falls under one of these categories. So I thought this would be a good place to help frame our discussion for today, is to start with this flow chart. So next slide, please. On the IVD side, so that lower portion here in the purple, if we start with the IVD pathway, I think the first thing to point out is that, the EU uses this term medical device software. The medical device software, or MDSW, is used in place of that software as a medical device terminology. And that is more all encompassing. And really, the EU uses this terminology because it doesn't actually regulate software with a functionality that's limited to storage or communication or compression. And it's also software that has to fulfill a medical purpose. So it's intended to drive or influence the use of a medical device, and that's still considered to fall under this definition. And that's the main distinguishing feature, is that, according to the IMDRF notes, software as a medical device cannot drive a medical device, whereas under the IVDR, that would be all inclusive. So when you look at software, if its sole purpose is intended to drive or influence the hardware of medical devices without itself creating information for medical purpose, in those cases, it's not actually considered to be a medical device software, but it's still covered under this regulation as an accessory for a medical device or an IVD medical device, or as potentially an integral part or component of a medical device. So really your first step to qualify under the IVDR is to verify that the software is intended for in vitro diagnosis. So an in vitro medical device means a device which is a reagent, software, or system, whether used alone or in combination, intended to be used for in vitro examination of specimens from the human body. And that can be for the purpose of identifying information about a physiology or a pathology, congenital impairments, physical impairments, predisposition, safety and compatibility, treatment response, or monitoring therapies. So in all of these cases, the focus is on that definition of an IVD. If you fall under, and your intended purpose for your software is substantially driven by the IVD data sources, that would be when you would be covered under this regulation. If not, then you would be covered potentially under the medical device regulation. So next slide. Just to show how that would apply. So suppose you are still questioning whether or not you fall under IVD or medical device. Your first step, if you are falling under this sort of all-encompassing definition, is to determine whether or not MDCG 2019-11 applies to you. And that's where we get the definition of software. It's a set of instructions that processes input data and creates output data. It's a very broad definition. But the guidance here defines the criteria for the qualification of software that falls within the scope of medical devices. Input data is really any data that is provided to the software in order to obtain that output data. Whereas the output data is any data produced by the software. So that could be screen display data, print data, digital documents, or audio files, recordings, all of those sorts of things would fall under the definition of the output. So next slide. So suppose you have now, you fall under that definition, and your answer to the question is yes, I do fall under the definition. In step 2, this is where you ask yourself, is the software a medical device, Annex 16 device, or an accessory. And so in that case, you're asking yourself, is the software driving or influencing the use of a hardware medical device that may be qualified as an accessory? So if the product is an MDR Annex 16 device, then those could be things like, contact lenses, products that are intended to be totally or partially introduced into the human body through surgery. It could be a substance for facial filling or dermal filling, that sort of thing. There's a lot of different definitions, but they're quite specific. An accessory for a medical device means an article which, while it itself is not a medical device, it's intended to be used together or as part of a particular medical device to enable the device to work in accordance with the intended purpose. So if it's software driving or influencing the use of a device, that's where the software is intended to drive or influence the hardware, but it does not have or perform a medical purpose on its own, and it doesn't create information on its own for one of those medical purposes. So the software can be limited to things like operating or modifying through some sort of an interface, or supplying output directly related to the hardware functioning of that device under the MDR. So in the next slide, the step 3 is going to be focused in on that intended purpose. So we know now that a medical device is really any instrument that is being, and in this case, software, that's being intended to be used alone or in combination for the purpose of diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment. There's a lot of different aspects of that intended purpose statement. So when it comes to an in vitro medical device, though, because it can be used for a variety of different purposes, it can make it a little bit more complex in terms of identifying whether or not you are performing one of those functions. There are so many different categories, but if you get to step 3 and you are finding yourself saying that the software performing the action on the data is different than storage, archival, communication, or simple searching, if you're not doing any of those functions, then you would stop here. But really, the goal of software as a medical device is to aid in one of the traditional intended purposes of a medical device. Okay, step 4, here's where we bring in the clinical benefit. We're aligned on our intended purpose. The intended purpose is aligned with a medical device. But what about the benefit? Is the action that is being undertaken by your software for the benefit of the patient? Just think about it in terms of not only the clinical benefit that you can specify through like a measurable patient relevant clinical outcome, but it could also be something like predictability, reliability, or usability if there really isn't a direct clinically relevant output. So in addition to the clinical evaluation or the performance evaluation of your device, remember, we're going to be needing to consider the benefit risk ratio in light of the state of the art. And that's going to help us with really drilling down on this point of the clinical benefit. There are a lot of different aspects that are specific hazards that could need to be introduced into this assessment of sort of that benefit risk. Those can be everything from, the type of disease, the patient's condition, the usability, all the way down to how the software is designed and some of the technical characteristics of the platform for that software. So there's a lot of considerations that you're going to want to take into account when determining sort of that benefit risk analysis for software in particular. Okay, the next step then, step 5, this is really where you ask yourself, do you fall under that broadest definition of medical device software? So it kind of loops us back to where the IVDR starts. So really under the MDR, there's a bunch of added steps where they try to determine what your classic definition would be. Whereas I do think this medical device software definition is really more helpful for all of us. A medical device software is software that's intended to be used alone or in combination for the same intended purpose as a medical device. Software must have a medical purpose on its own to be qualified as a medical device software. It's important to pay attention to that intended purpose, because the intended purpose as described by the manufacturer of the software is going to be highly relevant for the qualification and the classification for any of these devices. Okay, next slide. Here we're going to talk about the regulatory pathway for software. The IMDRF has come straight out and acknowledged that software is a critical aspect of healthcare. And there are a series of documents that they've provided that help us with some of the basic definitions, characterization, and the application of some of these quality system principles that are based around software. These documents are going to provide some of the harmonized principles for adoption based on your own regulatory framework. And really, the goals and strategy and the basic overlying principles and concepts for this harmonized software framework are illustrated by this figure. And there are some specific guidances that will help you out here if you are stuck at a certain point along the way. So whether it's the definition, you would look at that N2 document, the risk framework, that N12 document, or if more of your questions are aligned with that QMS, that's where that N23 document could be extremely helpful. If you get to the point now where you're ready to undertake the clinical evaluation or performance evaluation, that's where that N41 document is going to be the most helpful. But for that high level overview, if you're just getting started and trying to get sort of a lay of the land, the document that I've included down there is at the very bottom of this slide, that final document from 2017 really provides a very good overview. Overall, this document, it's encouraging manufacturers to use some of these same principles that we apply to any medical device to help us better understand how to modify software and to take into account real world performance. And that's really the goal of putting it under the same regulations as any other medical device. Ultimately, the healthcare decisions are going to rely on information provided by the output of software. And these decisions can impact clinical outcomes and patient care. And that's really why the global regulators are expecting that the performance metrics for a software should meet the same level of scientific rigor and are also dictated by the level of risk and the potential impact of that software to affect clinical care. And our goal then is to demonstrate and reassure the notified body of the safety, effectiveness, and performance of the software in particular. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about clinical evaluation. A lot of these same principles are extremely aligned with what we're already familiar with in the MDR world or the IVD world. The clinical evaluation process itself doesn't really change much. It's defined as the set of ongoing activities conducted during the assessment and analysis of a software's clinical safety, effectiveness, and performance as intended by the manufacturer. So again, it loops back to that intended purpose. So being very clear on your intended purpose is critical. For the purposes of the IMDRF guidance, that valid clinical association, that's your scientific validity. That's used to refer to the extent to which the software's output is clinically accepted or well-founded. So you want to look at the full body of evidence, and you want to reassure the notified body that in order to establish that scientific validity, that the software's output corresponds accurately in the real world to the healthcare situation and to the condition which you've identified in your software definition statement. A valid clinical association is really going to be critical before you even get started. So that scientific validity, I always recommend to do that early in the process. And a lot of the information you're going to gather through that scientific validity is going to ultimately help you in that next step, which is the analytical validation. That's where you actually measure the ability of the software to accurately, reliably, and precisely generate the technical output using the input. So it's going to confirm and provide evidence that the software is constructed properly. So the processing of that input data and the generation of the output data provide an appropriate level of accuracy and reproducibility, all of the same types of factors that we take into account when we evaluate an IVD, things like precision. So all of those types of performance measures are still appropriate, whether you're talking about the IVD or the software. You also want to show that the software meets its specifications and that those specifications conform to the user needs and the intended use. And the analytical validation is generated, that one is going to be generated and determined by the manufacturer during your verification and validation phase of the software development lifecycle using your QMS. It's required and necessary for any software as a medical device. That final step then is the clinical validation. That's where you actually measure whether or not the software can yield a clinically meaningful output associated with the target use of the software in a healthcare setting. And it's going to be based on the condition that you identify early on in your definition statement. So that's the trickier part I found. The analytical validation in the analytical performance objectives are quite straightforward, but the clinical validation requires some thinking and some strategy because the clinical impact of the software is defined as being a meaningful or a measurable patient relevant clinical outcome that is relevant to the function of the software. So it's things like diagnosis, treatment, risk prediction, treatment response, or a positive impact on the individual or public health as a whole. So the clinical evaluation gets evaluated and determined during the development of the software as sort of a pre-market and post-market approach. And it can be really thought of more as the relationship between those validation experiments and validating your algorithm and that clinical condition. So you really want to make that link between the scientific validity and the analytical validity, and then show the direct clinical impact. This is also going to be a necessary requirement for software as a medical device. Okay, the next slide will describe in more detail what we really mean by that intended purpose and sort of how that bigger picture comes into play. You know, how you go from input to output using your algorithm and how you align that with a very well-defined intended purpose. A lot of factors can affect the output of a software, and not all of these aspects can be identified by your intended use. So we want to focus in on two factors. Your software definition statement needs to make a statement about the intended use with regards to the significance of the information provided by the software in terms of the healthcare decision. So that's going to be things like the treatment, diagnosis, how it's being used to potentially drive or inform clinical management. The next one, that state of the healthcare situation or condition, that's where it's also going to be structured in terms of the level of severity for the clinical situation or condition. And then ultimately, you want to describe the core functionality of your software. So that will also include a definition of critical features or functions of the software that are essential to the intended significance of the information. So how do you, if you're defining it as critical, how is the software going to allow you then to provide insights to adapt to that potentially critical situation? That's the easiest way to think about where the intended purpose fits into the bigger scheme of things when it comes to software. Okay, next slide is going to be focusing and drilling down into that risk classification. And here's where it starts to get fun, because once you qualify as an IVD medical device, the next step under Annex 8 of the regulation is to figure out where you fall. And there are really three different rules that we apply here. Rule 1.4 tells you that it's the software which drives a device or influences the device falls within the same class as the device. If it's independent, you have to classify it by its own right. So if in doubt, if you are part of or driving the influence of the device, they are going to want you to go into that classification of that device itself. But let's say you have more than one intended purpose. That's where that 1.8 rule comes into play. If there are multiple intended purposes, the device will fall into more than one class. You're going to go to that higher risk classification. And again, that 1.9 is similar in that if several classification rules are going to apply to you, always go to the higher class. If in doubt, you're going to scale up, not down. There are some definitions and some examples in MDCG 2019-11, but there's questionable relevance or sort of helpfulness, I guess I could say, about how useful those examples really are. And there's a lot of back and forth as to whether or not those examples are contradictory in and of itself. But the general idea is that they have these classifications from 1 to 3, so the 1 is the lowest classification. That's going to be a software potentially that can provide information for serious or non-serious health conditions. But if you fall under that serious health conditions, you could be classified as category 1 if it's providing information to inform but not drive clinical management. Otherwise, it's really hard to fall under this category 1. They've really made it a very narrow definition. Category 2 is going to provide information relevant to a non-serious, serious or critical healthcare condition, but it's things like software that's used to treat or diagnose a health condition. If it's a non-serious health condition, things like a software that monitors carbohydrate intake or blood glucose levels to help you calculate your insulin dosage. That type of thing would fall under a category 2. Now, category 3, this is where you are falling under that serious conditions, or it's driving clinical management for a critical condition. So that's going to be more like risk data for certain types of cancer, or something that's going to inform like a preventative interventional treatment or interventional strategy for that patient. So again, driving that clinical management. That's where you start to bump up to class 3. Class 4 is going to be used to treat or diagnose a critical health condition, and it's high impact. So things like, a particular software that helps in visualization of a malignancy or something along those lines. But that's the basics of how these software are classified. So in the next slide, I'm going to point out the challenges of this classic definition because if we go to the medical device software, there are basically 3 different rules that could potentially apply. We have rule 11, 15, and 22. 15 is very limited. That's going to be contraception apps, and that basically says to use class 2B. Rule 22 tells you that you're class 3 if you're an active therapeutic device with an integrated component that's going to determine patient management. But really, mostly we're focused in on this rule 11. And if you interpret rule 11, it's going to say that if you take the literal interpretation of rule 11, as I've written out here, it can reasonably be interpreted that all software is class 3 because under some circumstance, it's reasonably possible that there's a situation where the information provided could lead to a risk. It could be highly unlikely, but you can't close the door that that's not a possibility. So instead, the regulators are recommending that we take that first part of Rule 11 under the guise of the IMDRF software risk framework. And that's going to focus more or less on the significance of the information. So the previous slide is where we're going to try to focus on. Don't take this literally. If in doubt, go back to that risk classification. Some things, though, to keep in mind. In general, as we're transitioning, if you are transitioning from MDD to MDR, software is usually going to be classified into a higher risk class than you had before. Class 1 is not going to be very common. Software in Class 1 is intended to be used only by patients and doesn't really provide any monitoring of physiological processes. So Rule 11 in and of itself is incomplete, and it assumes that all critical software is really either diagnostic or therapeutic, but that's not true. And it does, open up a possibility that if you have software with a potentially high risk of injury that doesn't fall into the higher risk class, it could by default get classified as class 1, and you don't want to take that approach. You always want to aim higher, not lower. But if you have a software that's serving a diagnostic or a therapeutic decision-making function, that could be classified as, class 2A or higher, you could actually be sort of putting yourself too high. So the bigger issue really is that Rule 11 is inconsistent across the other rules. There's no reason to have diagnosis and treatment grouped together, because all of the other rules group those two things separately. Diagnosis and treatment are two very different intended purposes. So by default, that Rule 11 is going to push everything up to having a higher risk class because it's implying that it's directly impacting the treatment. And that's really the challenge. So there have been some further attempts to clarify the classifications, but they haven't helped as much as they would have liked. Those are the two that I have listed here, the 2019-11 and then the updated clarification in 2021-24. The new guideline still doesn't really address the problem that Rule 11 is severity based and it's not risk based. So we really are going back to that risk analysis. That risk classification is kind of the best approach to take if it's unclear under Rule 11 where you fall. Okay, and finally, in the last slide that I'll present before we get to our question and answer session, I wanted to just point out the general safety and performance requirements, because in the EU, once the software qualifies as an in vitro diagnostic medical device, you must demonstrate compliance with the GSPRs that are outlined in Annex 1. If some of them aren't applicable, you should be prepared to provide justification. And there are certain harmonized standards, though, that are directly relevant to software compliance. So, for instance, GSPR 13.2, that requires devices to be designed and manufactured in such a way to remove or reduce the risks associated with negative interaction between the software and the IT environment in which it's operating. And then GSPR 16 is really focused on the software, and that's going to describe some of those analytical features, which we mentioned before, things like repeatability, reliability, and performance that's aligned with the intended use. But it should take into account the development life cycle and your risk management. So that's the other aspect to keep in mind. There will be some minimum requirements concerning your hardware, your IT networks, security, protections, those sorts of things that you should also take into account to ensure that the software runs as intended. And then the final one is GSPR 20.4.1, which is addressing the information required in your IFU, your instructions for use. And it requires that the instructions for these devices with electronic programmable systems, including software, meet the minimum requirements concerning hardware, IT networks, and IT security measures. So that's going to be, again, focused in on that risk management and the protection from unauthorized access so that you can run the software as intended. It's all designed to show that you have met those performance and safety requirements to ensure that the device performs as intended. And in this case, your intention is for the software to run correctly and to fulfill its medical device function. Okay, so that is basically the background that I thought would be helpful for today's webinar. We wanted to leave plenty of time for the question and answer portion because we have gotten quite a few questions that have come in. So our goal today was really to help you gain a greater understanding of the impact of these regulations on software. And I'm hoping this gave us some sort of context as we're starting in on the Q&A portion. So a big thank you to everyone who submitted our questions ahead of time. If you haven't had a chance to, you can actually ask questions in the Q&A button, and we'll try to get to as many as we can here. But I will turn it over to Mark so that he can start to assemble some of these questions that have come in.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. So I'd like to move to questions for today. We'll start with some questions that were submitted with registrations, but we will take your questions live as we go on. So please submit them to the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar controls. And of course, if you have any issues finding this or with anything else in the webinar, please just chat and we can help you. So with that, I'm going to go to our first question. So first question, Sarah, is do you have any have advice regarding how to demonstrate analytical and clinical performance of a SaMD?
Yes. So in our experience, the analytical performance is pretty straightforward. Think about how you validated the software in the first place. The clinical performance, though, that's going to be the tricky part. You want to determine how your competitor devices really are assessing performance in real world clinical settings. I think that's where, that scientific validity report or the state of the art section can be a really helpful tool as you're setting out collecting your own clinical performance data for your software. So I always recommend doing a quick search of what data is out there in the published literature regarding your competitors and trying to determine what is the most impactful, the most relevant clinical performance measure. So for instance, suppose you have a device that's looking at pathology specimens where it's like it can take a picture of a specimen and it's sort of a visualization tool that you can use to transmit slides electronically. In that case, you may not want to focus in on the accuracy of the diagnosis because that could be affected by any number of factors outside of your software's role. But the performance of your software could be something as simple as the time to diagnosis, the ability, to speed up the diagnostic process, the ability to identify or correlate with the accuracy of traditional methodologies. So think about it in terms of if your software wasn't available to the clinician, what would they have to do to get the same piece of information out of that test? And then think about, well, the advantage of my software is XYZ. That's going to be your clinical performance objectives that you want to hone in on. It could be speeding up the diagnosis, improved accuracy because you can share the information more readily across electronic health systems. There's any aspect of it, but ask yourself from sort of a basic perspective, if my device wasn't available to a clinician, what would be the downfall of that? What would happen?
Excellent. So our next question from registration is how does IVDR compare to FDA regulations for SaMD IVDs?
So there have been a few good posts. I will see as I'm talking here if I can find my link that I've saved. I tend to save a bunch of these links as they get posted. BSI, I know, has put out a really helpful one here. So I will see if I can find that and put it into the chat here. According to the BSI group, they really, they kind of classify and describe the main differences between the FDA regulations and the software. The biggest thing is going to come down to sort of how you classify it and group it, because under the EU, we consider the EU considers software as an IVD device, whereas the FDA tends to use more of like a risk framework to clarify what software is not in the scope of its regulation. And the EU uses the function of the software. So with the FDA being more aligned with risk and the EU being more aligned with intended purpose, it can lead to some misalignments. So in a way, the FDA is a little bit easier because you can classify your software through browsing various FDA databases and find sort of an applicable code or request additional help or information with classifications. That makes it a little bit easier, but from the perspective, like sort of a bigger perspective, the EU and the US do not regulate software intended for conducting clinical investigation or population-based epidemiological studies. So that's kind of one point that we agree upon, because it isn't providing that diagnostic or treatment information for an individual, even though it can provide more of a population level insight. In terms of like sort of that clinical evidence, the EU and the FDA, they both require clinical evidence through that performance evaluation process. The FDA has put out some guidances, but in the EU, there's that particular MDCG guidance, 2020-1, that is specific to clinical evaluation of medical device software. And so the technical documentation too, the EU has certain annexes, I think it's 2 and 3, that help you with technical documentation that you need for software. The FDA also has a guidance regarding its content of the pre-market submissions for software that can help you with identifying what's going to be necessary and required. But really, the main difference is going to start at the very beginning. It's going to be your risk classification. Are you falling under a higher risk classification than under the FDA versus the EU? That can be entirely possible just based on the misalignment between the intended purpose and the risk. Okay. Oh, so this is a fun one. Okay, so the next question here, a strategy for combining IVD and research use only software on the same device. In a word, no, they don't really want you to be both. You are one or the other in the most classic sense. A research only device is not intended to be used with humans, and it's not intended to provide results to patients. So those would be used in more of like an educational or a laboratory-based setting. What I've seen, and let me see if I can find this really quickly. There is a really good RAPS discussion board I found on this. And there's also a FDA has put out a guidance for how to approach this from the FDA's perspective. I think in the RAPS discussion board, they mentioned that some companies have gotten away with doing 2 different catalog numbers, and that helps you differentiate between your IVD and your research use only. But your IVD is the one that's going to have, it could have effects on your labeling. So you want to make sure that your IVD it has like that software functionality is really clearly defined. Like what's the software's function as and the software's role in the IVD versus the RUO. So the software could stand alone and certainly be used as a component of either system, but you're really talking about sort of conceptually like this combined functionality that, yeah, realistically people are using RUO products to drive discovery of new potential clinically relevant biomarkers and testing modalities. So, but when you're approaching this from the IVDR perspective, you want to make sure that you're very clear in distinguishing whether or not you're one or the other. You can't be both.
Excellent. Sorry for that last
Oh,
question.
no, no.
Let me go to the next one. I would like general advice on interfacing non-CE marked upstream inputs to the test, e.g. genotyping.
Okay, so this is another fun one. If there have been some limited guidances as far as how to approach this, and I'm thinking, if I'm thinking about this from the perspective of either a non-tested biomarker as being one of those inputs into that's getting imported into the algorithm, and from like a genotyping perspective, I mean that could be, even the inputs from like different genomic tools or databases and things like that. So really, it's going to come down to making the case that the um, the inputs are clinically relevant. So that scientific validity is going to be extremely important in those cases. If you're talking about things like, creating a risk assessment algorithm based on something like a database like ClinVar or something like that, that's going to be a little bit easier to make that case because you can then describe what is the scientific value of a large database like ClinVar or some of these other genomics databases, and use that as your validation for why it's being used for the purposes of this particular risk stratification. But it's going to require a really careful attention to that scientific validity report and sort of how to craft that argument.
Excellent. Okay. Before I go to the next question, I want to remind you all that you can submit any questions you have via the Q&A button on the webinar tools bar. I also want to remind you that you can reach out to us at consult@criterionedge.com to schedule some time to talk with our specialists if you have any more detailed questions specific to your case. We're available to chat with you about your current or upcoming project needs and answer more confidential questions in a free consultation. You can book a meeting at the link that is in the chat as well. Here's our next question is, how do you determine what is a substantial contribution of IVD data for an IVD SaMD?
This comes up quite a bit and it goes back to that original process flow document. What you're ultimately talking about is whether or not you're going to fall under the definition under the IVDR or the MDR. Ultimately, we're coming at this as from the perspective of the writers, where I'm not a regulatory specialist, but I have to be knowledgeable of all of the regulatory requirements in order to fully support them in the writing. But the way I would approach this would be, if you have a software and the primary input that your software is using in order to create the output is being derived from the IVD. So, and the classic definition of the IVD, it's samples being taken outside of the body, then you would fall under the IVDR methodology. Ultimately, IVDR's definition of software is so much more broad than the MDR. So you can't really use that to help you figure out that substantial contribution. But think about where the input comes from, and that's going to really tell you whether or not you can make the case that it's coming from an IVD, from the test results, as opposed to the medical device, the implantable.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of our questions. Unless anyone has a last one to put in there, we do have a few minutes, but in any case, thank you, Sarah, and all of the participants for the excellent questions. Our team will be sharing some links in the chat and will remain on the webinar for a few more minutes so you can access these. If you enjoyed our webinar today, you may want to sign up to be notified of additional upcoming webinars produced by Criterion Edge. You can do so by clicking the link provided in the chat. If you still have questions on the content discussed today, or if you'd like to learn more about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with our specialist. Our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com, or you can see Sarah's email as well on the screen. Or you can book a meeting time, a convenient time for you, with the link that's in the chat. This webinar is recorded and will be available soon to watch on our website, and will be sent out to you in an email with the slides and all of these announcements. When you exit the webinar, please take our short survey and let us know how you enjoyed the talk today and what other topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for all your questions. We hope this presentation gave you more insight for your submissions. Have a great rest of the day, and we will see you next time.